County Land Records list the Whitfield place as Parcel 118, Hollow Creek County, homesteaded in 1887 under a federal land patent signed by a clerk whose name has long since worn off the paper. The file is thin, 190 acres. A farmhouse built in 1912. Corn and soybeans, a small dairy herd sold off in the 80s, and a debt that had been growing quietly for 6 years by the time anyone outside the family knew its size. That file does not mention the draw. On a Tuesday morning in March, Harold Whitfield, 68, stood in his kitchen, holding an envelope from Hollow Creek Farm and Trust, and did not open it for 11 minutes. His wife Louise, 65, watched him from the stove, a pan of eggs going cold behind her, because she already knew what letters from that bank looked like, and she had learned that Harold needed the 11 minutes more than she needed the eggs to stay hot. When he finally opened it, the letter said what both of them expected it to say: 90 days. Default on the operating note. A sale date set for the courthouse steps in June. The bank had been patient, as banks measure patience, which is to say, they had sent 4 warnings before this one, and this one was not a warning. "We're not the first," Harold said, folding the letter back along its crease like it might still be undone. "And we won't be the last." Louise did not answer him. She had heard him say true things before that were not comfort, and she had stopped expecting the two to travel together. Word travels fast in a county with 1 feed store and 1 diner, and by the following Saturday, when Harold drove into town for seed and fence wire, he could feel the difference in the way people at Voss Feed and Seed did not quite meet his eyes. Old man Voss himself, who had extended credit to 3 generations of Whitfields without ever once writing a formal note for it, rang up Harold's order without mentioning the letter at all, which Harold understood as its own kind of mercy. It was only at the door, as Harold carried his sacks out to the truck, that Voss said, quiet enough that nobody else in the store would hear it, that a man who had farmed that ground as long as Harold had ought not let a banker who had walked it once in 40 minutes decide what it was worth. Harold did not know yet how literally that sentence would turn out to be true. Their daughter, Sarah Whitfield, drove up from the state capitol 2 days later, not because her parents had called her, but because her mother had, in a voice too even to be anything but frightened. Sarah was 39, a hydrogeologist for the State Water Resources Division, a job that had taken her about as far from the family's 190 acres as a person raised on them could get and still work outdoors. She had left the farm at 18 with what she would later call, only half joking, an allergy to owing anyone anything, and had spent the 20 years since studying the one resource that had never once, in 6 years of bad markets and worse weather, crossed her mind as something her own family's land might actually possess in any quantity worth discussing. She sat with her parents at the kitchen table that had not changed in 30 years and did the math with them, out loud, because Harold had never once done it out loud with anyone. The operating note, the equipment loan behind it, the 2 dry years that had gutted the corn yield when a June drought sat over the county for 5 straight weeks and never broke. The land itself appraised the previous fall by a man named Dale Pruitt from the bank's regional office, who had walked the property for 40 minutes, taken photographs of the barn roof, and valued the whole 190 acres at just above what the family owed, which on paper made it a survivable sale and in practice made it a very fast one. He didn't walk the draw, Harold said. He meant the low wooded gully that cut across the northeast corner of the property, a stretch of land too uneven and too wet in spring to plant, the kind of ground every farm in the county had a version of, and every appraiser in the county learned to ignore inside the first 5 minutes of a visit. Said it wasn't tillable, so it wasn't worth his time. Sarah did not think much of that detail at the table. She thought about it 3 days later, driving the fence line with her father in his truck, when she noticed something her professional training had trained her to notice, and her childhood had trained her to overlook entirely, because she had walked past it 1,000 times without a single thought. At the bottom of the draw, even in a dry March after 2 drought years, there was standing water that had not frozen all winter, and a patch of ground around it that stayed green 2 full months before anything else on the property greened. "That's just the spring," Harold said when she asked. "Been there my whole life. Grandpa used to water stock off it before we ran the well line out to the barn." "Has anyone ever tested it?" Sarah asked. Harold looked at her, the way a man looks at a question he has never once had reason to ask. "Tested it for what?" what Sarah suspected, and confirmed over the following 2 weeks with a borrowed pressure gauge. A flow meter checked out from her office on a pretext she did not fully explain to her supervisor, and 3 separate site visits she made on her own time, was that the spring in the draw was not simply a spring. It was the surface expression of an artesian aquifer, a body of groundwater trapped under enough pressure by layers of impermeable clay above it that it did not need to be pumped to reach the surface. It found its own way up, the way it had likely been finding its way up for longer than anyone had owned the land at all, through a natural fracture in the rock that ran, as best she could map it without proper equipment, in a line that connected the draw directly to Hollow Creek itself, a half-mile downstream. She stood in the mud at 6 in the morning, with the flow meter in her hands, watching the needle hold steady, even after 4 dry weeks, with no rain to feed it, and felt something she had not expected to feel about a piece of ground she had spent her whole childhood trying to get away from. Surface water rises and falls with the season. It answers to rain, to snowmelt, to whatever the sky is doing that month. What she was looking at answered to none of that. It came from a confined layer far below the frost line, insulated from drought, the way almost nothing on the surface of a farm ever is, which was, she would later explain to her parents at that same kitchen table, the entire reason it mattered so much to a town 12 miles away that was watching its own municipal wells drop a little further every summer. Artesian aquifers are not rare in the way people assume rare things underground should be. What is rare is one that has never been formally claimed, measured, or drawn into a modern water rights system, sitting quietly beneath a farm that had spent 138 years thinking of it as a low spot good for nothing but cattle. Sarah understood something about water law that her parents did not, because it was not the kind of thing a person learns unless their work forces them to. In much of the western United States, water rights are governed by what is called the doctrine of prior appropriation, a rule usually summarized in 4 words: first in time, first in right. It does not matter, under that doctrine, how much water sits beneath a piece of land today. What matters is who was first to put that water to a documented, continuous, beneficial use, because the person who proves that earliest date holds what is called a senior water right, and a senior right does not get cut off in a drought the way a junior one does. In a shortage, senior rights get their full allocation first, and everyone junior to them takes whatever is left, which in a bad year can be nothing at all. Most farms never think about any of this, because most farms' water use was formalized decades ago through modern permits, filed and dated and filled with juniority the moment they were signed. What almost nobody in Hollow Creek County remembered, and what Sarah found only because she went looking in a courthouse basement most people in the county had never once had reason to enter, was that the original 1887 homestead patent on parcel 118 included, in language so old-fashioned it read almost like scripture, an explicit grant of what the clerk at the time called stock and domestic watering rights to the spring situated in the northeast draw of the claim, continuously exercised from the date of settlement forward. That single clause, buried in a patent nobody had reread in over a century, was what water law calls a vested right, a claim that predates the state's modern permitting system entirely, and is treated, when properly proven, as senior to nearly every other water right in the county, including the much newer municipal permit that the town of Cassidy Ridge, 12 miles east, had been trying for 3 years to expand so it could draw more heavily from the same underground system to serve a growing subdivision. Sarah did not know any of that last part until she called an old graduate school contact who now worked for the Regional Water Authority and mentioned, almost in passing, the location of the draw. Whitfield. The contact repeated back to her, slowly, as in the parcel 118 Whitfields. It turned out Cassidy Ridge's engineers had already mapped the same underground fracture system Sarah had found on her own, tracing it from municipal test wells nearer the creek, and had already begun quiet conversations with the county about what it might cost to secure additional water rights along that line before the subdivision's next phase broke ground. Nobody at the town, and certainly nobody at Hollow Creek Farm and Trust, had connected that fracture system to a 138-year-old clause on a homestead patent that predated the entire modern water rights ledger. Sheriff Ezra Colton, who Sarah called mostly because she did not know who else in the county to call with a discovery this strange, walked the site with her the following week, less out of any official duty, and more, he admitted, out of the same curiosity that had once sent him out to a stone-marked field 2 farms over. He did not pretend to understand the hydrology. What he understood, he said, standing at the edge of the draw with his hands on his belt, was that a piece of paper nobody had read in a century was about to matter more than every tractor on the property combined. "Best get that filed proper," he said, "before anybody with more money than patience gets there first." Filing it proper was neither fast nor simple. It required a licensed water rights attorney, a certified survey establishing the exact historical extent of the claim, and a formal adjudication hearing before the state engineer's office, all of it running against the same 90-day clock the bank had already set in motion. Sarah spent 3 weeks living out of her childhood bedroom, working her state job by day and her family's case by night, tracking down an 1894 county assessor's ledger that showed the Whitfield family had in fact paid a small annual water fee on the spring continuously for over 4 decades before record-keeping practices changed, and the fee simply stopped being collected. Not because the right lapsed, but because the county clerk's office at the time had quietly folded it into general property tax without anyone updating the water registry to match. The adjudication hearing was scheduled for a Thursday, 9 days before the sale date printed on the letter that had started all of it. Sarah stood before the state engineer's office with the 1894 assessor's ledger in one hand and a certified survey in the other, and answered questions for 40 minutes about fracture geometry, historical continuity of use, and whether the family's more recent water use had lapsed the claim at any point in the intervening century, a question that could have ended the entire effort with a single wrong document. It had not lapsed. The small annual fee, however quietly it had been folded into general taxes decades earlier, had never once stopped being paid, and payment, under the doctrine, was itself a form of continuous beneficial use. Dale Pruitt, the bank's appraiser, was informed of the pending claim 11 days before the scheduled courthouse sale. He did not believe it at first, which Sarah understood, because she had not entirely believed it herself the first week. What changed his mind was not the history. It was the numbers a water rights broker put in front of him 2 days later, once word had quietly reached Cassidy Ridge's water authority that a senior claim existed on the fracture system they needed. In an unregulated water market, a modest senior right in a drought-prone basin can be worth several times the value of the farmland sitting above it, particularly to a growing municipality with no legal way to simply take what it needs from a claim that predates its own. The bank did not forgive the debt. Banks rarely do, and Harold would have distrusted one that tried. What happened instead, in a courthouse conference room 2 days before the scheduled sale, was a negotiation nobody at that table had walked in expecting to have. A representative from Cassidy Ridge's water authority sat across from Dale Pruitt and a bank attorney, a folder of hydrology reports between them, and said plainly that the town needed the water more than it needed a fight over who owned the right to it. "You're telling me a 130-year-old spring is worth more than the farm sitting on top of it?" Pruitt said. Not quite a question. "I'm telling you it's worth more than the note," the water authority representative answered. "What it's worth to the town is a separate number, and it's bigger." Cassidy Ridge's water authority offered the Whitfield family a long-term lease on a defined portion of the senior right, enough water annually to satisfy the subdivision's expansion needs while leaving the family's own stock and domestic use fully protected, structured as an annual payment large enough, once the numbers were run, to retire the operating note entirely and refinance the equipment loan on terms that did not require anyone to sell a single acre. Harold signed it at the kitchen table, the same table where he had opened the foreclosure letter 11 weeks earlier, and he did not say much, because he rarely did, on the days that mattered most. Louise cried at the stove again, but this time the eggs were not the reason. Sarah drove back to the state capitol the following Monday, though she found herself, in the months after, making the trip home considerably more often than the job required, and eventually, not really because of the job at all. The draw itself has not changed. It still floods in wet springs and stays too uneven to plow, exactly as it always has, exactly as the appraiser dismissed it in under 5 minutes the previous fall. What changed is who understood what it was worth and why. Sheriff Colton still mentions it sometimes, when a new appraiser or a curious out-of-county buyer asks him about the strange little parcel where a 100-year-old homestead clause outmuscled a modern bank, and he tells them the same thing he told Sarah standing at the edge of that draw in March, that in Hollow Creek County, the ground has a way of remembering what people forget to write down, and every so often, it hands the bill, or the blessing to whoever is still standing there when it finally comes due. Harold still walks that draw most mornings, the way he always has, though these days he tends to stop a little longer at the low wet spot in the northeast corner than he used to, not out of habit this time, but out of something closer to respect for a thing that had been quietly holding his family's future the entire time nobody thought to look down. The Whitfield file is closed. Hollow Creek County keeps hundreds more like it, filed under names you have not heard yet, on land that looks like nothing worth a second look, right up until it is. If you want to be here when the next one is opened, subscribe to the registry, and we will keep pulling the files.